Ever get that, like, almost creepy feeling?
Yeah.
You buy something and you're like, why did I just do that? Like, we think we're all logical, weighing pros and cons.
Right. Comparing prices, making sensible choices.
But what if, and stick with me here, what if most of what's really driving those decisions is totally hidden from us? Like, happening in our brains without us even knowing.
That's exactly the mystery we're diving into today. You sent this in. Phil Barden's Decoded the Science Behind Why We Buy, and it is a doozy. So in this deep dive, let's pull out the really juicy bits, the science behind why. Out of all the options, we pick that one.
Love it. And forget all those old school marketing tricks, even those purely rational economic theories. This book throws those out the window, right? Like, it shows us there's some seriously unexpected stuff happening when we reach for, say, that brand of cereal over this one. As the listener who flagged this, you were probably hoping for a clearer, more, I don't know, evidence-based look at what makes consumers tick, right? And that's exactly what we're aiming for.
Absolutely. So to kick things off, let's look at where maybe traditional marketing and economics kind of miss the mark. And the author, Barden, he starts with this analogy. You ready for this? Tycho Brahe.
Brahe, like the astronomer from way back. Not exactly who I'd expect in a marketing book.
Right, but it's surprisingly relevant. Brahe, he spent years just observing the stars, like tons and tons of data, super detailed, and without all his work, Kepler and Newton, they wouldn't have had the base to figure out their laws of physics.
So Brahe's data was like the foundation.
Exactly. So Barden argues, and he actually echoes what Paul Ormerod says about economics, a lot of the classic theories about why we buy stuff, they're not built on like real-world observations, not how people actually make choices in the moment.
So instead of watching first, then theorizing, it's like they made up a theory, then tried to make reality fit it.
Precisely. And these starting assumptions, while they might seem logical at first, they don't hold up that well in the real world. Like the idea that we make decisions with perfect information, or that we can rationally compare, say, the value of a vacation with a new phone. If you've ever impulse bought anything.
Oh, tell me about it. Right.
You know, real life's way messier. We copy what other people do, our own habits trip us up, and what we want can change depending on, the mood we're in, where we are.
Like if I'm hungry at the grocery store, forget it. All bets are off.
Exactly. And once you factor those things in, those elegant economic theories start to look, well, a little shaky.
Same in marketing. Right. We assume people can explain why they do what they do. Like if you ask someone why they bought those shoes, they'll say comfort, style. But the book suggests there's a whole other level of influence they're not even aware of.
Right. It's that classic saying, people don't know what they want until you show it to them. Barden calls out this backwards way of thinking in both economics and marketing that assumes we can explain our choices after the fact.
Okay, so then the million-dollar question, right? If we're not always consciously aware of what's making us choose one thing over another, what is?
Both fields, economics and marketing, they kind of downplay the role of emotions. Regret, that fear of missing out, how emotions can be contagious, seeing someone else excited about something.
Or how once you own something, it suddenly feels way more valuable.
Exactly, the endowment effect. But even deeper than that, there are these unconscious factors. The environment we're in when we decide, spreading ourselves too thin so our goals get weaker, our past choices kind of locking us into certain paths, and framing.
Oh, framing. We got to come back to that.
Absolutely. And this is where Rory Sutherland in the Foreword makes this great point. He says this behavioral science Copernicus revolution, it hasn't fully hit marketing yet.
Like we're still stuck in the old ways.
Kind of. And he quotes Upton Sinclair, who said, and it's so true, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." There's resistance to new ideas, especially if they challenge what you've built your career on.
Makes sense. But good news, this book isn't just about what we're doing wrong. It actually gives some solid, practical advice.
Right. It's not just theory, it's a guidebook. Barden shows you how to use this stuff, apply these findings in the real world.
So what was it about the author's background that led him to write this, to come up with this whole decode approach?
Okay.
He mentions working at some big-name companies for like 25 years, right?
Yeah, he spent decades at places like Unilever, Diageo, T-Mobile, actually trying to figure out how to influence what people buy. And he saw firsthand that even with all the fancy market research, all those models, the real why behind our choices, it was still a mystery. He talks about how 80, even 90% of new products fail. And even those super expensive ad campaigns, they're not a guaranteed win.
Wow, that many failures.
Yeah.
That really shows how little we actually know about what makes people tick.
Right. And it makes sense that CEOs, they'd be concerned about this. Barden cites this survey by the Fornes Marketing Group, and get this, 80% of CEOs felt that marketers were, I'm quoting here, disconnected from actual results.
Like marketers are off in their own little world.
Kinda. The survey said marketers need to become more focused on ROI, on proving their worth in actual business results, not just vague metrics. That's probably why, even a few years ago, not many top companies had a chief marketing officer on their board.
So to get a seat at the big table, marketers need to show they understand the bottom line, the actual financial impact of their work.
Exactly. And that includes being able to explain things like brand equity in a way that makes sense to the finance folks. We all kind of get that strong brands have value beyond the product itself, right? Like, people pay more for a Starbucks latte than for a basic cup of coffee. But what exactly is that extra value in the consumer's mind? And how does our brain actually process that?
And that's where the author's own thinking shifted while he was at T-Mobile, right?
Yeah, he was VP of brand development there, trying to refine their strategy. And that's when he encountered this new model of marketing based on the latest findings from like neuroscience, behavioral economics, all that good stuff. It explained things that had baffled him before, but it also challenged some of his long-held beliefs about how consumers decide what to buy.
Well, it's been a pretty big deal to move away from traditional marketing thinking to this more scientifically grounded approach.
It was, for him, a huge shift. He saw that relying on evidence, not just assumptions, could have a major impact. It wasn't just a new way of talking about consumer behavior, it was a new way of doing marketing. Brand strategy, product development, advertising, even digital media.
And it sounds like the results at T-Mobile were pretty convincing. That dance campaign he talks about, that was a home run, right?
Oh, yeah. In a crazy competitive market, that campaign in 2009, it had a 146% return on investment. Sales jumped 49%, market share up 6%, and they cut their customer acquisition costs in half.
Those are the kind of numbers that make CEOs pay attention.
Right. And it wasn't just a fluke. They applied this approach across the board to every way they interacted with customers, and they cut customer churn in half. They went from having the highest churn rate in the UK to the lowest. And this method, it worked so well, they rolled it out across Europe, and T-Mobile ended up winning over 400 awards for their branding and marketing.
He also talks about the Deutsche Telekom rebranding, which was guided by these same Decode principles. Another big success story.
Definitely. So Deutsche Telekom, under their brand manager, Hans Christian Schwingen, they unified all their different tea brands into one single tea back in 2008. And they did it all based on Decode's approach, with this core brand promise of life is for sharing. It wasn't just about simplifying their product offerings, it was about creating a consistent brand message across Europe. By 2008, they were the fourth most valuable telecom brand in Europe, and since 2014, they've been #1, and globally, they're #2. Their brand value has increased almost 7 times in just 13 years.
Wow, that's impressive. So after seeing all that, no wonder the author was so into decision science that he ended up joining Decode himself.
Right. His own experiences showed him the limits of the traditional models he'd been using. He was convinced that this knowledge, this deeper understanding of decision-making, it was the key to building strong brands and ultimately driving revenue. So he left T-Mobile and joined Decode.
And Decode isn't just some random consulting firm. They have serious academic chops, working with places like Caltech.
Oh, yeah. It was founded and is run by actual experts in decision science. They partner with top universities like Caltech's neuroeconomics department to stay on the cutting edge. Their team includes PhDs who also teach, and they work with everyone, from brand managers to ad agencies, creating this really cool mix of scientists and marketers, bridging the gap between theory and real-world application.
So the book is kind of this bridge between the academic world of decision science and the everyday challenges of marketing.
Exactly. It's about taking all this complex research and making it useful for people who actually work in marketing. It's a framework, a common language, a toolbox to help marketers understand why people choose one brand over another.
And the potential benefits are huge, right? Like if you understand the why behind consumer behavior, you can create more effective campaigns, clearer communication, and hopefully avoid some of those product launch disasters we talked about.
Absolutely. And for marketers, this knowledge is power. It gives them a way to prove their value, to speak the language of business results, to get that seat at the boardroom table. This updated edition, it even includes new case studies about how consumer behavior changed during the COVID-19 pandemic, which shows how relevant this stuff still is.
Okay, so this brings us to the heart of decision science, which the book defines as the study of, well, how we decide things. And the key concept here is this idea of System 1 and System 2 thinking, developed by Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his work.
Yeah, Kahneman's research is fundamental. He basically said that our thinking, and therefore our actions, are guided by two systems. System 1 is fast, intuitive, automatic. System 2 is slow, deliberate, effortful.
Could you break those down a bit more?
Sure. System 1, it's like our autopilot. It works effortlessly without us even realizing it most of the time. It's quick, it processes a ton of information simultaneously, it relies on associations, and it learns gradually through repetition. It's designed to let us react quickly and intuitively without overthinking things. This automaticity, it's crucial for efficiency, for saving mental energy. Back in the day when resources were scarce, this was a big advantage for survival. System 2, though, it's our manual mode. It's slow, step by step, and requires a lot of mental energy and focus. But it's also flexible, allowing us to think things through carefully and make more considered decisions. It's what we use for complex problem solving.
And the book mentions this brain imaging study where people saw their favorite brands and their brains actually showed what they called cortical relief. That sounds like a classic System 1 response, right? The brain's like, oh, I know this, I can relax.
Exactly. When they saw their favorite brands, their choices were super fast, and the brain areas associated with deep thinking, they actually showed less activity. That's the cortical relief. But the areas involved in intuitive decision-making, especially the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which combines emotion and decision-making, those areas lit up. It means that strong brands, they trigger this almost automatic gut-level response.
But, and this is important, it was only for their absolute favorite brand, which led to this first-choice brand effect. And that ties into Byron Sharp's idea of mental availability, the chance that a brand will pop into your head when you need something.
Right. It was only the top brand, not even their second favorite, that triggered this response. So for marketers, it's not enough to just be considered. You got to be the first brand that comes to mind. If you're not the first choice, you're not getting the sale. And this aligns perfectly with Sharp's idea of mental availability, the likelihood that a brand will be top of mind when a consumer is ready to buy.
He uses that baseball bat and ball riddle, you know, the one, to show how System 1 can lead to these quick but wrong answers.
It's perfect for showing how that immediate gut response can sometimes override logic. Most people instinctively say the ball costs 10 cents, but the correct answer is 5 cents. It shows how we often go for the easy, seemingly obvious answer without engaging System 2. And of course, Kahneman's whole thing was showing how our decisions aren't always perfectly rational, like traditional economics assumed. He brought psychology into the mix.
Okay, so we have System 1, fast and intuitive, and System 2, slow and deliberate. What are the implications for marketing? Because it sounds like there's a ton of research happening in all these different fields related to decision-making.
There is. Every year, there are thousands of research papers published in neuroscience, consumer psychology, behavioral economics, all giving us more data on how we make decisions. The challenge for marketers is figuring out how to use this information, how to apply it systematically.
And the book suggests that Kahneman's framework, this System 1 and System 2 model, gives marketers the structure they need to make sense of it all.
Exactly. It's a simple but powerful model. And it's backed up by a ton of research, including neuroscience. He even uses the Stroop test, that thing where the color of a word conflicts with the word itself, to show how System 1 and System 2 can clash.
That test, where you have to say the color, not the word, it's harder than it sounds. It really shows how our automatic reading, which is System 1, gets in the way of the more deliberate task of naming the color, which is System 2.
Right. And he also compares it to driving. System 1 is like autopilot, great for routine stuff. But when something unexpected happens, you got to switch to manual control, which is System 2. Most of the time, we're on autopilot, and we don't even fully understand how it works.
Which brings us to just how powerful this automatic system, System 1, really is. He talks about that honesty box experiment with the eyes.
Oh yeah, that one was subtle but effective. Just putting pictures of eyes near the honesty box for coffee and tea donations, it actually made people pay more. They weren't even aware of being influenced. It shows how System 1 picks up on cues from the environment, even stuff we don't notice, And those cues can affect our behavior.
And System 1 can process like 11 million bits of information per second, compared to System 2's measly 40, 50 bits.
That's a huge difference. Our senses are bombarding System 1 constantly, whether we're paying attention or not, and all that info can potentially influence us. There's even research showing that we form first impressions online in less than a second, and those first impressions, they stick.
So all those online ads that flash by in a second or two, they're definitely targeting System 1.
Absolutely. With such short exposure times, most marketing communication is filtered through System 1. It's like the cocktail party effect, when you're in a crowded room and you suddenly hear your name. That's System 1 picking up on something important even though you weren't focused on it.
So how does this super powerful System 1 learn? He keeps mentioning this phrase, what fires together wires together.
Right. System 1 learns through association, not like how we learn in school. It's about making connections between things that happen at the same time or in the same place, especially if it happens a lot. Like how a kid learns what no means. It's not just the word, it's the tone of voice, the facial expression, all those things happening together. And over time, those repeated pairings create neural links in the brain.
He uses this analogy, footprints in fresh snow. The more you walk on a path, the easier it becomes to follow.
It's a great visual. Just like those paths in the snow, the associations in our brain, the ones we use a lot, they become stronger and easier to access, like how the smell of coffee can be linked to the idea of gathering after many shared coffee breaks. Our brain creates this huge network of connected memories. He even mentions the 10,000 hours rule about how we develop expertise or intuition within System 1.
So even experts, people who seem to make decisions based purely on gut feeling, they're actually drawing on this vast storehouse of implicit knowledge built up over years of experience.
Exactly. And a lot of times, even they're not fully aware of all the subtle cues they're picking up on, they just call it instinct. And consumers, they're experts in buying and using products and brands. They've spent years doing it. They've been bombarded with marketing messages.
Okay, now, we need to talk about framing. It sounds like this is a key part of how System 1 influences us.
It's huge. Framing is about how the way information is presented or the context surrounding a decision can totally change how we perceive things and what choices we make, often without us realizing it. He uses this example of a skin cream. Same exact cream, but in different jars.
And people thought the cream in the fancier jar was more effective, even though it was the same stuff.
Right. The jar, the packaging, it acted as a frame that influenced how people judged the cream. And then there's that study in the shopping mall where the smell of cookies made people more helpful.
So our environment, even smells, can frame our behavior.
Totally. Our internal state, how we're feeling, and the environment, they're constantly framing our thoughts and decisions. He uses that optical illusion with the gray squares, where the same shade of gray looks different depending on the background.
Right. The background color changes how you perceive the gray.
Exactly. The background subtly changes how we see the foreground. In the skin cream example, the jar is the background, the cream is the foreground. And this happens unconsciously. System 1 provides the frame, System 2 focuses on the main thing, and together they create our experience.
So this leads to this really cool idea, brands as frames. This helps explain the power of branding, right?
It does. Traditional marketing models struggle to explain things like packaging, design, the overall feel of a brand. This idea of brands as frames, it says that brands are like the background that influences how we experience a product. Like you see that Pantene Gold capsule, you know it's Pantene even without the logo.
Purely through association. Like those blind taste tests where people say the Coke tastes better even if it's the same as the generic cola.
Exactly. And there's the example of the VW Chiron and the Ford Galaxy. They're basically the same car, but people will pay more for the VW because of the brand. And then there's Starbucks. They've framed their whole experience as a mini vacation, which justifies the higher price. And he points out that culture matters too. Like Starbucks in China, it's a status symbol.
So this extra value added by the brand, that's what we call brand equity. And it's even more important for things like services, where it's harder to judge the quality objectively.
Absolutely. For services, data, digital content, the brand is crucial for differentiating yourself. Look at the Kantar brand Z list. It's full of tech, telecom, and service brands. And there's that brain imaging study from the University of Munster where they showed people the same news story but from different sources, like the Times versus the Sun.
And people's brains actually responded differently based on the source, even though the story was the same.
It's incredible. The media brand, it acted as a frame that shaped how people perceived the information. This whole brand as frame idea, it bridges the gap between product-focused sales and image-focused marketing. It says that the brand and the product aren't separate, they work together. The brand enhances the perceived value of the product. Without the brand, the product is just a generic thing, especially in a crowded market. And this helps explain why companies pay so much for brands, like how Coca-Cola's intangible assets are worth way more than their factories and equipment. Decision science gives us a way to understand this implicit stuff that traditional marketing often misses.
But if this unconscious influence is so strong, why do we underestimate it? Why don't we realize how much brands are affecting us?
It's a great question. Consumers rarely say brand is the reason they bought something, even if they paid a premium for it. Barden talks about this GfK study on watch buyers. They identified material enthusiasts as key buyers, but they didn't mention brand. And he's like, how does that make sense? Especially for cheaper watches, the materials are pretty much the same. Even for more expensive watches, brand wasn't a main driver, according to the study.
So it sounds like when we try to explain our choices, we're relying on System 2, our conscious thought process, which doesn't have access to all the stuff happening in System 1.
Right. In that skin cream study, people focused on the cream's effects and the price. They didn't even consider the packaging. We just can't see everything that's happening in System 1, so when you ask people why they did something, they don't always have the full answer. And this is why brand effects are often underestimated in research. The influence is indirect, it's not something we're aware of, we're focused on the product, not the brand that's framing it. If we want to understand and manage brand effects, we have to decode what's happening in System 1.
And he does touch on the actual neuroscience, like the parts of the brain involved in System 1 and System 2.
He does. System 1 involves areas like the sensory cortices, which process what we see, hear, etc. The orbitofrontal cortex, which is about rewards. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which combines emotions and decisions. The amygdala, our emotional center. And the basal ganglia, which is involved in habits and rewards. System 2, it mostly uses the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is our working memory, and the anterior cingulate cortex, which helps us focus and resolve conflicts. He recommends a paper by Matthew Lieberman if you're interested in the nitty-gritty neuroscience.
And then he moves into decoding the automatic system, which is a preview of what's coming in Chapter 2. Sounds like we've learned a lot about System 1 in the past few decades.
We have. Thanks to new techniques like priming paradigms and fMRI, we have a much better understanding of System 1. It's not this mysterious black box anymore.
And he lists some key modules of System 1: perception, implicit expectations, implicit attitudes, and implicit motivations. Can you give us a quick overview of each?
Sure. Perception, it's how we experience marketing through our senses. It's mostly unconscious. And he challenges the idea that our perception is like a camera. It's actually much more active. Implicit expectations, that's what we expect from a product or experience, often based on the brand. Like how that brown pudding tasted like chocolate just because of its color, or how decaf coffee can actually increase your heart rate if you think it's caffeinated. Implicit attitudes, that's our unconscious feelings about brands and products, which can be different from what we say we believe. Like, a lot of people associate unhealthy with tasty when it comes to food. And that's why it's so hard for a brand known for junk food to successfully sell healthy options. And finally, implicit motivations. Those are the deeper, often hidden desires that drive our choices. We'll get into those more later.
So to some of this deep dive, it's clear that our buying decisions are this fascinating mix of conscious thought, which is System 2, and all this unconscious stuff happening in System 1. And sounds like System 1, with things like framing and associative learning, it's way more influential than we realize.
Absolutely. For you, as the listener who sent this in, understanding these hidden forces is crucial if you want to really understand consumer behavior. It's not just about what people say. It's about what's happening in their brains.
This has been really mind-blowing. It makes you think twice about all those little things that are influencing us every day. It's like, now that I know about brands as frames, I see it everywhere. I'm looking at my own buying decisions in a whole new light. Yeah. And this deep dive, it feels like we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in Decoded, especially about perception, expectations, attitudes, and motivations. We'll definitely be coming back to this.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks for listening. And until next time, happy decoding.